Right, so for the next few episodes, we're going to be looking at inputs, how you can use inputs in your Genie and what they do. Now, it really underpins what you've got to know about in theory. My favourite page, page 258, shows all of the different kind of inputs you're expected to know if you're studying this course. We're going to cover a few of these and how to use them, but it's a good idea to just scan over this list and familiarise yourself with all of them pretty much. We're going to be looking at LDRs, thermistors, for example. Now, these are analog resistive type interfaces, and in the next episode I'm going to be looking at one of these analog inputs using a resistor. So we've got LDRs here, a light sensor, that is, a resistor here, and this thing here called a potential divider will vary the input voltage. Anyway, we'll cover this in the next episode, something you need to know. Now, we also use LDRs and things like that for digital inputs. So, for example, a slotted opto switch. We'll cover that in a few more episodes' time. It's used to measure angles. So you can have a disc which has got a load of holes in it, and you can count the amount of times the light goes through it and measure the angle, that kind of thing. We'll be looking at quadrature rotation sensors. It's another kind of digital counting input, but you're a bit like the kind of thing that you'll find on a DAB radio. But you can count up and down with that kind of thing. And then obviously simple one like a potentiometer. We'll look at that in the form of a gamepad controller as well. Now, you might find, we're not going to cover all of these, but some of them you might actually be able to kind of figure out how to use it just using the basic principles. Now, if it's just a straightforward switch, for example, you might have a look at making some kind of burglar security system and look at one of these PIR sensors. It measures infrared light, senses infrared light. So if a warm-blooded mammal, say a cat or a person, can trigger this, it's just basically a switch. So just understanding how you can use it if you power it up. It's always worth, if you're considering buying one of these, just looking at the specifications and seeing what kind of input and outputs, currents, that kind of thing you're going to need to look at. So this is fine for our purposes because we use 4.5 to 5 volts anyway. And it will give an output signal of 0.3 volts. So that might not be quite enough to trigger the microcontroller if it's a digital input there. If it goes into a digital input, you might want to kind of play around with the analog input and just set the range to be quite low, for example, although it might be okay, that kind of thing. And again, the current you can see is tiny little microamps, so that'll be fine. And then this would be used, either you could use the output into a microcontroller and choose what happens. Maybe there's a wait before a motor comes on, or a voice message saying, please leave the premises. You name it. You know, you as a designer have got a wealth of opportunities to make your ideas come to fruition. It's just to understand the building blocks. So, yeah, in this episode, we're going to look at a few of these types of things, or just kind of cover an overview. But also we're going to need to introduce you to the first concept of using an input. Now, we're going to cover this in the next episode, as I mentioned. But if you've got a digital input like this, straightforward digital input, generally in electronics we use this arrangement. You've got this resistor, what's called pulling down. So it's a pull down resistor. Connected to 0 volts. Now, I'm not going to cover it in a great deal of detail. It's just familiarizing yourself with this setup and why you use it. Because basically, if you don't have this connected, if it's just a straightforward switch from the plus volts going in, which makes sense, if you switch it on, you get the plus volts in, that's a logic 1 high, and then if it's open, it's a logic 0. However, if this is not connected here and this is open, there's nothing connected to this input, and that causes a phenomenon called a floating input. So it doesn't actually know if it's on or off. Now, it's something to do with impedance, which is something we're not going to cover in this basic electronics. But all you need to know about is this is the setup we use generally. Now our Genie project boards have got these resistors built into them, so you can just plug a switch straight into it like this. But familiarise yourself with this, because it is something that you needed to know about if you're studying the course. Now you can also have a pull-up resistor, which is where it's connected to the plus volts and the switch is down here. So it means when the switch is open, the logic input is 1, and when you close it, the logic input is 0, assuming it's a normally open switch. So yeah, something to bear in mind there if you're going to deal with just straightforward switches, but you don't need to worry about that if you're using a Genie board.